Oxford University's 800-year history had never witnessed such profound silence. Professor Harrington had just declared, "Africa has contributed nothing to human civilization." Ibrahim Traore raised from his seat as 500 academics held their breath. But no one could have predicted that his words over the next 10 minutes would go viral and the end of the professor's career. The Sheldonian Theatre at Oxford was packed that March afternoon. It was meant to be a routine lecture on global leadership in the 21st century. Ibrahim Traore, president of Burkina Faso, sat quietly in the front row, dressed in a simple dark suit, taking notes. At 3:30 p.m., Professor Edmund Harrington took the stage. A man in his late 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he commanded respect through decades of published work. Rhodes scholar, author of 12 books, holder of 3 honorary doctorates. His tone was confident, almost dismissive, as if the conclusions he was about to present were beyond dispute. When we examine the pillars of human advancement, Harrington began, we see a clear pattern. Mathematics from Greece, law from Rome, philosophy from Germany, industrial innovation from Britain. Several audience members shifted uncomfortably, but Harrington continued, emboldened by the academic setting that had long protected such views. Then, 20 minutes into his lecture, Harrington made the statement that would define the rest of his life. "I challenge anyone in this room to name a single significant contribution to human civilization from sub-Saharan Africa. The continent has been a recipient of civilization, not a contributor to it." The silence that followed was deafening. In the front row, Ibrahim Traore slowly closed his notebook. He placed his pen carefully on the desk beside it. Around him, several African students sat frozen, caught between outrage and the intimidating atmosphere of challenging such a senior professor. Then Traore raised his hand. "Yes?" Harrington acknowledged him with barely concealed irritation. Traore stood, his movement deliberate and calm. "Professor Harrington," he began, his voice carrying despite not using the microphone, "I would like to respond to your assertion, if I may." Harrington's smirk widened. "By all means, mister." He pretended not to know who Traore was. "Traore, Ibrahim Traore," he replied simply, not mentioning his title, "and I accept your challenge." A ripple of anticipation ran through the audience. Several people began discreetly recording on their phones, sensing something significant was about to unfold. Traore walked to the podium with measured steps. For a moment, he stood silently, looking out at the audience, then directly at Harrington. "Professor," he began, "before I address your challenge, may I ask you a question? In your extensive research, have you ever visited the manuscript collections in Timbuktu? Have you studied the mathematical treatises of the Dogon people? Have you examined the metallurgical techniques of the Haya people of Tanzania?" Harrington waved his hand dismissively. "Ancient mud buildings and primitive folklore hardly constitute civilization, Mr. Traore." Several gasps could be heard from the audience. But Traore remained calm. "Then let us begin with something you might recognize," he said, holding up a photocopy of an ancient text. "This is a page from the Lebombo bone, discovered in Swaziland. It's 44,000 years old, Professor. It contains the earliest known mathematical calculations in human history. 29 distinct notches marking lunar cycles. Mathematics didn't begin in Greece, Professor. It began in Africa." The smirk began to fade from Harrington's face. But Traore wasn't finished. "You want more recent examples? Very well. Let's discuss the University of Sankore in Timbuktu, which housed 700,000 manuscripts and educated 25,000 students in the 12th century. When Oxford was still a collection of drinking holes, the audience was now completely silent, hanging on every word. "You mentioned law coming from Rome. Shall we discuss the constitution of the Ashanti Confederacy, which included checks and balances 3 centuries before the American Constitution, or the Buganda Parliament, which had a complex system of democratic governance while Europe was still ruled by absolute monarchs? You speak of philosophy from Germany. Have you read the philosophical texts of Zera Yacob, the 17th century Ethiopian philosopher who developed ideas about rational inquiry and human rights that preceded the European Enlightenment?" Harrington tried to interject. "These are isolated examples," but Traore held up his hand, and surprisingly the professor fell silent. "Isolated, Professor. Let me tell you about isolation. It's when the Library of Alexandria, founded by an African dynasty, housed the world's knowledge, while the ancestors of Oxford's founders were still living in mud huts. You want contributions to civilization? Let's talk about medicine. The first successful cataract surgery was performed in Mali in the 14th century. The first cesarean section where both mother and child survived was performed in Uganda in 1879, using techniques that wouldn't appear in European medicine for another 50 years. The first vaccination, not Edward Jenner's cowpox, but variolation against smallpox, was practiced in West Africa and brought to America by enslaved Africans. He pulled out another paper. Metallurgy. The Haya people of Tanzania were producing carbon steel in blast furnaces 2,000 years ago, a technique that wouldn't appear in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. The bronzes of Benin are so sophisticated that when Europeans first saw them, they refused to believe Africans could have made them, so they invented theories about lost Portuguese craftsmen. Traore paused, looking directly at Harrington, who was now visibly sweating. But perhaps most importantly, Professor, let's talk about Ubuntu, the philosophical concept that I am because we are. While European philosophy was obsessing over individual rights and conquest, African philosophy was developing concepts of restorative justice, collective responsibility, and human dignity that the so-called civilized world is only now beginning to understand. The tragedy, Professor Harrington, Traore said, his voice now soft but piercing, is not that Africa contributed nothing to civilization. The tragedy is that scholars like you have spent centuries actively erasing, ignoring, and denigrating those contributions. When the library of Timbuktu was at its height, housing more books than any European university, your ancestors called us illiterate. When our astronomers were tracking the movements of the stars, you called us superstitious. When our healers were performing complex surgeries, you called us witch doctors. He pulled out one final document. This, Professor, is a letter from Cecil Rhodes, founder of the scholarship that perhaps funded your education. In it, he explicitly states that African history must be suppressed to justify colonization. Your ignorance isn't accidental, Professor. It's the result of a deliberate, systematic effort to erase African contributions to human civilization, and you've been perpetuating it for 47 years. The silence in the theater was absolute. Harrington stood at the side of the stage, his mouth opening and closing, but no words emerged. Traore concluded, the question isn't whether Africa contributed to civilization. The question is why you, a professor at one of the world's most prestigious universities, don't know any of this. Or worse, why you know it and choose to deny it. The first clap came from a young African woman in the third row, then another. Within seconds, the entire theater erupted in thunderous applause. Students stood, then professors, then even administrators. The most remarkable reaction came from Professor Mary Whitfield, head of African Studies. She stood and spoke into her microphone. Mr. President, she said, acknowledging Traore's actual title for the first time. As a member of this institution, I apologize. I move that Oxford immediately review and revise our history programs to include the African contributions you've outlined. The applause renewed, even louder. Harrington, isolated on the side of the stage, looked around desperately for support, but found none. His decades of authority had evaporated in 10 minutes. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Within hours, videos of Traore's response had been uploaded to social media. Titles like, African President, Destroys Racist Oxford Professor, and the most epic takedown in academic history. By the next morning, the videos had millions of views. News outlets around the world picked up the story. The hashtag Africa Built Civilization began trending globally. Professor Harrington released a statement the following day, announcing his early retirement to pursue personal interests. Oxford University issued a formal apology and announced a comprehensive review of its history curriculum. The Sheldonian Theatre would host a new annual lecture series on African contributions to global civilization. The first speaker, Ibrahim Traore. But perhaps the most significant outcome came from the students. Enrollment in African studies programs surged across British universities. Young historians began traveling to Africa to study in archives that had been ignored for centuries. A year later, Oxford University unveiled a new statue in its main quadrangle. It wasn't of Ibrahim Traore, who had declined the honor. Instead, it was of Ahmed Baba al-Timbuktu, the 16th century African scholar, whose 1,600 books on law, medicine, philosophy, and mathematics had educated generations while Oxford was still in its infancy. The inscription read, "Knowledge has no color, wisdom has no continent, truth belongs to all humanity." In an interview years later, Traore reflected on that day at Oxford. "I didn't go there intending to give that speech," he admitted. "But when Professor Harrington made his statement, I thought of all the African children who would hear such words and believe them. I thought of all the brilliant African minds throughout history whose contributions were erased or stolen. I couldn't remain silent. The real tragedy," he continued, "is not what one ignorant professor said. It's that his views were considered acceptable in an institution dedicated to truth and knowledge. How many students had sat through his lectures over 47 years, absorbing these lies? How many went on to positions of power, carrying these prejudices with them? That's why I had to speak, not to humiliate him, but to break the cycle." The interviewer asked if he felt his response was too harsh. Traore shook his head. "For centuries, African history has been written by those who enslaved us, colonized us, and exploited us. They had no interest in acknowledging our achievements. When you've been denied your history for so long, speaking the truth isn't harsh, it's necessary." Professor Harrington had 47 years to learn the truth. He chose ignorance. I simply chose not to let that ignorance stand unchallenged. Today, the Traore moment, as it came to be known, is studied in universities worldwide as a turning point in academic discourse about African history. It serves as a reminder that knowledge, real knowledge, requires humility, curiosity, and a willingness to challenge long-held assumptions. It proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon against prejudice isn't anger or violence, It's truth, delivered with dignity, and backed by irrefutable facts. And in classrooms from Lagos to London, from Cairo to Cape Town, teachers now begin their lessons on African history with a simple truth that should never have been controversial. Africa is not just part of human civilization, it's where human civilization began. The silence that fell over Oxford University that March afternoon wasn't just the end of one professor's career, it was the beginning of a long overdue conversation about whose stories get told, whose achievements get recognized, and whose contributions to human civilization get remembered. The truth can no longer be silenced.